Welcome, everybody. All right. You know what? We're talking today about coincidence or God. The funny thing about coincidence is actually it's on the cover of Psychology Today, and I just thought the article was just so interesting that I wanted to do a show on it because I think it has very important qualities to it to understand coincidence and how we like to put things together. I think if you really look at one of the I think the greatest movies of all time is Forrest Gump. I mean that movie is so funny because it's so full of coincidences and just amazingly written and amazingly acted movie. And I just think we really enjoy the idea of coincidences and the kind of the magical connotations that it has around it. But one thing is fairly certain about coincidence. The phenomenon of coincidence really fascinates people and skeptics. And, it's a look into the most interesting philosophical questions that we can ask. Are the events of our lives ultimately objective or subjective? Is there a deeper order? Is there an overarching purpose to the universe? Is there a God in charge of coincidence? Or are these just lucky accidents of evolution, living in our belief systems fundamentally randomly around the world? The meaning that we choose to give coincidence is very individualistic. And, if you look at the word lucky, there's no trace of the word lucky in the Bible. Um, with people with highly empirical psychology, coincidence to them is basically happenstance or simultaneous events that no special significance or the law of probability are in charge of. But in reality, the most astonishing, incredible coincidence imaginable would be the complete absence of all coincidence. And that comes from John Allen Paulos, who's a professor of mathematics at Temple University in Philadelphia. Um, I think he also has written several books on this. But believing in the significance of things like oddities where things come together and converge is how important evaluation of how we think we are as people. And if it just happens and there's no reason for it, it takes that mystical ability of us to reach a little bit further into the events and try to look deeper at how things happen. I think it gives us comfort to think that maybe someone or something is in charge out there in the world that converges coincidence to make our lives better or worse. If you're a mystical type person, coincidence is synchronicity, which is a purposeful occurrence of two seemingly unrelated events. And so that argument is not likely to be resolved anytime in the near future. But the phenomenon of coincidence has begun to create a lot of scientific insights. And we'll talk about this later because there's a lot of research around it. And it turns out we may actually be hardwired to connect anomalies in a meaningful way. And many of the remarkable feats of our brains regularly perform, including our ability to learn the meaning of words, decode the unspoken laws of social decorum, or noticing coincidences, and even mathematicians, cognitive scientists, paranormal researchers also apply these tools of statistics and coincidence to try to prove their own theories. In AD 66, there was a comet that was seen across a sky in Jerusalem just as the Jewish people were revolting against the Romans. And in 1066, another comet appeared just before the Battle of Hastings was fought over the throne of England. And these were merely strange coincidences, but, was that a divine type of signal? Was there a divine intention for those comets to happen during those incredibly important events in the history of the world? Even in 1705, there's an English astronomer. His name was Edmund Halley, and he was looking through old records of comets when he noticed a coincidence. And the bright comets that were recorded in 1531, 1607, 1682, had almost the same orbits and appeared approximately every 75 years. So guess what? The name Halley. Halley concluded there were one comet and predicted it would reappear in 1758. And guess what? On Christmas night of 1758, Halley's Comet appeared, forever changing our understanding of comets, period. And so, coincidences do help prod science along, and they're really a paradox, and they seem to be a source of our greatest irrationalities, seeing causal connections when science tells us they're not connected. On the other hand, some of our greatest feats of scientific discovery depend on coincidences. In fact, we could not learn language and syntax without the ability to notice strange coincidences. You just think about learning a single word. And there's a scientist named Tannenbaum, and he said that every word is, in a sense, an infinite object. And it's not just a name for an individual thing, but it refers to an infinite set of things. The word dog, for instance, and I'm still quoting, to understand the simple word, you have to understand the name Rover and the type, say, like a chocolate Labrador, or all dogs, or all mammals, or all animals, all Labradors, all chocolate labs are free things. And yet children under 5 can be given just a few relevant examples of a dog and learn to use it. And so even more remarkable is that between the ages of 1 and 5, children are learning at least 5 new words a day. And I would say faster, actually. So they make lots of leaps by noticing coincidences. That dogs bark. They do all kinds of different things. They're led by humans on a leash. And so we look at these photographs, and then children can connotate coincidences and put them together about what a dog is capable of doing. And so drive many of our inferences. And and it's important. Guess what? Here's an interesting fact. And by the way, I'm not related to John Adams, but I'm related to his wife, Abigail Smith. And John Adams was our second president, and Thomas Jefferson, 2 men who shaped the Declaration of Independence. Talk about a coincidence here. They both died on July 4th, 1826, which is the 50th anniversary of the signing of that historic document, the Declaration of Independence. Talk about a coincidence. Pretty amazing. There's a psychoanalyst in the 20th century, the last century, and his name is Carl Jung, and he was a subset of Sigmund Freud. He was one of his groupies, and then he broke off. But he loved coincidence, and he loved to look at where it came from, what caused them. Are they meaningful? Are they random? And so he really sought to answer the questions. And so he developed a theory, and we talked about this word earlier, synchronicity, as a way to explain their existence. So the theory came about in response to almost unbelievable coincidence that he observed. And that was a patient of his told him during their session that she had dreamt of an insect, a golden scarab, the night before. And in the middle of the session, an actual golden scarab, which was highly unusual for that place and that climate, hit the window of Jung's office. And so by that, the theory later developed by Jung, it was an event of synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that couldn't be explained by science or psychology. And I have no idea what a golden scarab looks like, but I imagine that was a shock for him. Long before Jung's time, even the skeptics among us were fascinated by coincidence, and everybody loves it. It's kind of like entertainment, and we marvel over bizarre events. We tell our friends all about them, and we remember them for years. And so it really, we have to wonder, what is it about this that grabs our attention? If you just look from a straight definition, it's a remarkable occurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. And apparent is really the key word to the definition. So our tendency is to see patterns everywhere. And it means that sometimes we discover really cool truths about the world, And just as often, we're drawn to the, into dead ends. But if you look back at Jung, his early speculations and to even present day theory say a lot about coincidences. And he believed in meaningful coincidence. And he called those acts of creation in time. And they occur when we find our inner state mirrored in the outside world. And so to explain that, he's this phrase he used, which is meaningful coincidences, like that golden scarab insect. His concept of synchronicity ventured to the realm of parapsychology, and parapsychology is more like ghosts or spirits or stuff like that, the belief in that. And so he thought there was a way to unlock the link between meaningful psychic and physical phenomenon. And so he uses this word synchronicity, which takes the coincidence of events in space and time as meaning something more than just chance, that it's independent of objective events among themselves, and as well as subjective, meaning it's psychic to the observer and to the observed. And so how and why do these events occur? Well, Jung thought that the psychic event, for instance, the dream of the scarab, and the coinciding physical event, the actual scarab on the window, are objects of the same quality. And I know this is complex, and I hesitate to even communicate it, but it's important because a lot of the look at coincidence has come through Carl Jung's observations, and that causes them to co-occur or coincide. And so this theory, though it doesn't really have any scientific backing, a lot of people are unsatisfied with the answers and therefore have done more research to go beyond that. But I can tell you from a lot of research that our brains are really conditioned to look for patterns in how things relate to each other. And so it often doesn't take much for us to observe something and say, what are the chances? It could be spotting an old book that was recommended, or bumping into someone on the street who we haven't seen for a long time. We have to wonder, are these really coincidences? And after Jung passed, some of the psychologists and statisticians really have held more skeptical view about the meaning of coincidence. And so they call it a habit of our mind. And so the inclination is to find connections and patterns in random data, and that's what's called in psychology as apophenia. And so when we spot a coincidence, what's really happening is in their minds, our brain is simply exercising its ability to identify patterns, which is something we can do even when there are none. And so, coincidences may be explained by not only our predisposition towards patterns and connections, but also by several other cognitive biases that keep us from seeing the connections or the coinciding events. And so, in common thinking, coincidence is a type 1 error, basically. And this has to do with the false positives, I guess, if you look from a research perspective. And so our tendency is to believe that a hypothesis is true when it's not. And so, but to me, I believe that anything to do with human beings, anything to do with our brain, anything to do with the universe, anything to do with the earth is subjective. I really believe that from a personal perspective. I think there are hidden causes. I personally am a Christian, so I believe in God. I believe God's behind many coincidences in our life, because I've had a lot of incredible events that I know that I couldn't have cooked up myself. But, some psychologists have suggested that the frequency of coincidences we notice is pretty much related to how flexible our mind is to identify meaningful relationships. Our everyday lives allow the opportunity for countless coincidences to occur, and that's through the thing called the law of chance, it basically dictates that a coincidence will occur sooner or later. And so, without getting into a lot of probability theory, but statisticians basically agree that randomness itself may not be as random as we think because our innate thinking biases are always looking for these connections, looking for meaning. And that's one of the things that people have the deepest question on. What is the meaning of our life? What is the meaning of our life? And that draws back to the idea of coincidences. And that's what, when I was reading that Psychology Today article, I thought I've got to go deeper on this, and I got to really take a strong look and research this, because it does have a lot to do with our brain and the wiring of our brain. And, coincidences can open the door to wonder, which is a great thing. And that means our imagination is triggered, and it creates a lot of interesting events where we actually take action and do things we normally wouldn't do because we look at a coincidence and we learn from it, and we draw a different perspective on life through the coincidence. Some people take it as a signal that, hey, you need to wake up here. Wherever you stand on it, there's a lot of questions that awaken the nature of life and our human existence. But if you think of coincidence, it's one of the most interesting philosophical questions. And are the events of our lives ultimately objective or subjective, or is there a deeper order, a purpose to the universe, or are these just lucky accidents of evolution? And so we have to ask that of ourselves. We have to ask that of life. But there's a lot of studies, that have happened. And why do people study coincidences? To explain how they work and use them in our daily life. But there's other aims, and they're anomalies. These anomalies may have a message. And then there's the astronomy of planets and galaxies that do not behave according to the theory of anomalies. And so, like dark energy and dark matter, we have a hard time reading that and understanding that. But coincidences are always telling us something that is missing in our world. And studying them basically helps uncover new ideas about us and the world. And it may be not a very strong thought process that leads to it, but what it does do is it triggers really good research. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to break down the types of coincidences and the facets of them. So come back. Welcome back, everybody. All right, we're talking about coincidence or God. And yes, we're going to talk about God and the Bible just a little bit. And I'm not going to be preachy, so don't worry about it. It's all about coincidence or God. It's about correlating and understanding. We're just coming at a topic, so don't get all crazy on it. So the 4 facets of coincidence, and this is from characteristics that are common to coincidence to establish a more scientific approach to studying coincidence, is number one, form. Most of coincidences come in pairs, and usually a mental event that matches an event taking place around you. And so, some come in a series of 3 or more, like a string of butterflies. And then there's this thing called process, and that's how they happen. Like sitting down next to a stranger or doing something different, or through public or personal media, or through encounters with nature. And then there's this other facet called explanation. And so many people think they are caused by God. Others believe they are random events. And so, some coincidences are unknowingly created by the person or persons involved. And so, better classification will produce, and this is from a scientific perspective, specific explanations for those type of broad generalizations. And then there's use. And this is important because coincidences can help with decision making, psychological understanding, interpersonal relationships, creativity, spiritual development, employment, scientific discovery, and even health. And they can also be funny and inconsequential, and some can lead to negative consequences, God forbid. And then there's this weird term, and it's a term called simulpathety. And that defines a specific, meaningful subclass of coincidences. And so this simultaneous experience it occurs without two people being together in the same place, and sometimes without conscious awareness of its source. But one person is in pain and the other person feels distress for no apparent reason. And you know what's interesting, and I hate to bring this tragic event up, but my mom and stepfather died in a plane crash in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They were flying their own plane. He missed the runway. Instead of going up and turning around, he crashed the plane on the runway because he lost speed. But what's interesting is I happened to be flying over Albuquerque, coming from Boston into Southern California. And it's weird that I was actually at the place where my mom crashed with my stepdad, and I felt something, and I literally was on the plane and I got up. I got up because I was in a panic and I never understood why. But there was this sense of feeling, and I have to admit this, and I know it's weird, but I really did feel a panic. And this was on a Christmas Eve of 2000, and that's when they died. But I found out the next morning on Christmas Day. But, it is interesting that we can, and I don't know how to define this scientifically. I don't even know if you can. But there was a conscious awareness that there was some kind of distress, and it came right through me. So, sometimes the distress is very similar to other person's pain. Often two people share a strong emotional bond. So the largest number of simulpathety reports comes from twins, although reports involving mothers and their children are also prominent. So, simulpathety suggests that individuals are more closely bonded than our science can actually identify. And this basically comes from a Latin term, simul, which means simultaneous, and pathos, which is a Greek for suffering. And this really differs from sympathy. A sympathetic person is aware of the suffering of another, but does not feel it. The simulpathety, one person suffers along with the other person, and they can experience some form of that suffering. So only later the simultaneity of distress is recognized. Although some twins just know why they are feeling the pain, other twins is now feeling it. They're very aware of that. Many twins can feel a sense for each other, even at a great distance, which is amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. We think we know everything, but we really don't. Coincidence and synchronicity, they basically are defined as striking occurrences of two or more events at one time. But the difference is that coincidence is perceived as chance or luck, while synchronicity implies the presence of a deeper intelligence at work. So there are only two ways to perceive an event in your life, either as a coincidence or evidence of synchronicity. And if you believe in coincidence, you live as a victim of life. You think life is happening to you, and that a coincidence is a random external event that has nothing to do with our own inner world. And so you live as a reactor to the external world. And so you're not yet conscious of the fact that you have the ability to think independently of your present circumstances, and that creates your own experiences. So that's kind of a magical, majestic look of life, and it's overlooked if you believe in synchronicity, because there is more to everyone and everything than what they appear to be in physical form. You know that there is an invisible essence of everything on the planet, and that possibly it's all interconnected. And innately, you may understand or recognize the power of your thoughts and begin to consciously choose thoughts and belief patterns that will most greatly serve you and the planet. And so you're deeply humbled as you begin to see the connection between what you're thinking about and what the universe is delivering to you, and what makes up your external world from that experience. So the recognition of a deeper intelligence at work holds you in a great state of awe and wonder at the mystery of life. And that's what coincidence can bring us. And so, there's some examples of precognition in the Bible. One of them is the story of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi was eager to find a new home for Ruth, who had recently been widowed. so she would be taken care of after Naomi had died. And so she instructed Ruth as to how to treat this guy Boaz and how to secretly his feet when he was resting to follow his instructions. And so, she predicted Boaz would react positively and want her for himself, Ruth for himself. And that's exactly what happened. Was that a coincidence that Ruth went to live with Naomi and take care of her? Or was that just supposed to happen? There's so many coincidences that happen in the Bible, that coincidences really get strengthened by the idea of what the Bible brings us, which is precognitions. And even if you look at the Old Testament is answered by the New Testament. So a lot of the Old Testament actually points to the New Testament. But the thing about the Old Testament with the fire and damnation that the Bible presents in the Old Testament, it's basically God meeting people at where they were and what they understood, because people didn't read, they didn't write oftentimes, they didn't really understand a lot of things, they weren't highly intelligent, they weren't in school, and so God had to meet them through fear and contempt and anger and all kinds of stuff, because those are things that they really did understand. But by the time that Jesus arrived and was our Messiah and was God on earth, he basically converted and took our sacrifices that people used to have to make in the Old Testament, and now he made the ultimate sacrifice of dying, and therefore we're all forgiven, and we no longer need to make sacrifices of death. And so there's my little thing. But, believers accept what appears as coincidence is indeed orchestrated by God, and that he cares about us, and God is not just in charge of big events in life, but everyday challenges in life. And I got to tell you, in my life, I have seen, and just in the last year, I've seen true acts of God in my life that I could never, ever, ever really attribute to myself. They were prayers and they got answered, but they got answered on God's terms and not on mine, which were better than what I ever wanted. And so, beliefs are foundational, and God, from a perspective of a believer, acts in each person's life, and that coincidences are one way to do that. When there's an explanation for coincidences, there's basically no coincidence. But our view of the world involves beliefs. And so some beliefs are open to empirical testing, not just by scientists, by everyone. But gravity, for example, can be tested every day by dropping, an apple from your hands. But proof of God requires faith. And, faith doesn't have a lot of science behind it. And so we have to look deep, 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 deep inside of us and ask ourselves, do we really understand that there is a God? And some people can get that deep and really attach to that, and others can't. But we often view ancient people as superstitious because how they ascribe to unusual events as an act of God. And this comes from all communities, not just a Christian community. But a belief in the divine intervention isn't found only in ancient civilizations, but in surviving remnants of indigenous cultures. And so, University of Missouri Columbia found that the most strongly endorsed explanations, and this is a quote, for coincidences were God and fate. And that not faith, but fate. And that's when it comes to unusual events. More than 200 years after the advent of modern science, God and fate still rank higher among college-educated than the naturalistic alternative. And so, if you look at the ancient times and today, it's not superstition, but personal experience. And to just take one example, Elizabeth Gilbert related her best-selling memoir, Eat, Pray, Love, to how she and a friend wrote a petition to God asking that Gilbert's agonizing months-long wait for her husband to sign their divorce papers would finally come to an end. And within hours of writing the petition, she got the long-awaited call from her lawyer saying that it was done. And that was back in 2006. When things like this happen to us and bring life-changing consequences, it can be really difficult to accept that they're nothing but the products of chance. But, some people believe that chance is a hypothesis that must be considered. And if you look at the moment, there are certain coincidences for which chance does not provide an adequate explanation, and these events simply may be improbable and meaningful, and maybe they're random. But we have to focus on a further question: if chance is not fault, is God the best alternative explanation? And that's the end all be all argument when it comes to looking at religion and God. It's really easy to see why people would think so, especially, striking coincidences happen so soon after praying. But there's a couple of essential points to keep in mind when considering, divine origin of events. First, there's increasing evidence that human mind itself has the ability to produce coincidences. And that's a theory that we're, talking about more than just selective attention or memory, that in our brains, we are able to coordinate something that is in the physical world and in our internal world. There is a connectedness between all human minds. And these interactions could easily explain common coincidences, such as thinking of someone just before they call, finding the right book, hearing a song on the radio that speaks to you and directly to a problem that you're having. If you take a close look at the way coincidences operate in people's lives, it really can unveil that these events often reflect the mental state of people who experience them. Rather than conveying divine guidance, coincidences often appear to act as a mirror to what is currently going on in the experiencer's conscious or unconscious mind. And so, and I'm coming from a non-biblical perspective there, but I'm trying to help explain some of the disturbing coincidences people experience, especially when dealing with mental illness. Certain patterns in coincidences, their tendency is to reveal repressed thoughts and emotions and to use personally meaningful symbolism to do so. And so, I'm often looking in therapy at what people are dreaming, what people are thinking, how consistent is this thought process, what kind of language are they consistently using, what kind of patterns do I see in how they describe the world and how they describe their relationship with people they're having trouble with. How do they account for it? Do they take responsibility or do they not? Are they drawing coincidences as being a victim and having negative things happen to them because of these coincidences working against their life? That can destroy people's self-esteem. So in psychology, it's really important to look at patterns. And patterns really can draw, and that says a lot about the brain. That brain does need patterns. Brain is constructed of patterns. Our life is constructed of lots of patterns. Many people hate change, and those people that hate change don't want patterns to happen to them. They want things to be the same over and over and over again because they fear that negative events will take place in their life or negative coincidences, so they don't put themselves out there for that. It's also important to recognize our ability to cause our own coincidences. Even if a coincidence we experience is caused by a mind other than our own, that mind does not necessarily belong to God. We learned about in church. But the truth is the truth is in the middle, and it's gray. And to me, it can be God. To me, it could be direct prayer. To me, I can believe in people having connected thoughts subconsciously. I mean, I can see so many things that our brain is inundated with, and there may not be any one direct answer in looking at coincidence. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk a little bit more about what's in that coincidence. We're going to talk about synchronicity just a little bit, and then we're going to go sum all this thing up and tie a bow on it. And come back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about coincidence or God, and I don't think there's any true answer that we can prove on either way. But ultimately, meaningful coincidences really do have a great potential impact on to enrich our lives and make them better. They can really be valuable guides to our conscious and our unconscious mental states, and they open our minds to aspects of our own psychology that we may be ignoring, and they can also potentially connect us to a form of intelligence that exceeds our own minds and what our minds currently contain. And so if you want to reap benefits from that, you got to really give a um, care not to approach coincidences with the idea that we already know what's behind them and what they mean. Whether they come from within us or without us, the value of a coincidence basically will always lie in its ability to show us something new about ourselves and the world around us. And so, with God, there's no such thing as coincidence. He knows all things and straightens our paths. Nothing happens without it passing through the hands first, and nothing takes him by surprise. So there's no way for something just to happen from a religious perspective. There's no such thing as the luck of the draw or pure luck or by accident or by chance. So, from a faith-based perspective, maybe we've been praying for something and without our even realizing it, a series of events unfold behind the scenes. And we get confused and even a bit angry at the way things are unfolding when it actually might not even dawn on us for a while that God's hand is in the situation and resolving something in a different way than we anticipate or want to control. And so from a religious perspective, maybe we've been praying in a way that it wants a result that we want, but God's hearing it and doing something bigger with it that involves other people's lives and changing their lives. But there's this thing, the synchronicity, which once again, as we talked about it before, that's events connected to one another, not by cause and effect, by by sympathies, by the belief that there's a relationship between events and something that happens to us. And so it's kind of like a crosstalk between your mind and the world and matter, and that there's a sense of attraction, and that attraction plays into how we carry into coincidences. And also dreams may oftentimes create coincidences in our mind and play out something that happens in our physical world, and so you can derive meaning from any kind of coincidence when an external event matches up with an event on your inside of you. You might be sitting in a waiting room, for instance, or reading a magazine about somebody when somebody says, okay, let's just say somebody famous. You think of somebody famous, and you're reading a magazine, and all of a sudden somebody calls the name of someone that you're reading about in the magazine, and all of a sudden they're there. What a coincidence. Woo! Wow. No, but synchronicity that is it basically is a coincidence that has, I don't know what to call it, but like an analog in the psyche, and it basically keeps those events and logs them down in our psyche. And depending on how you understand it, the event can inform you through intuition or emotion how near or far you are from the path of our soul. And we're souls living a human life. And so what's interesting is we can't really scientifically look at our soul and understand our soul, but our soul also drives us. And our soul basically comes from the idea of what God wants in our life. And our souls come from our passions. And so when we have passions, we have a tendency to want to relate things together in a stronger way towards where we're headed, because we're looking for basically a path. And we're looking for something to guide us. And so coincidences are oftentimes how we guide our lives, by recognizing, oh, here's that, and oh, here's that. And that gives us a sense of where we're supposed to be. Is that God? Is that us? I don't know, but we all tend to do that. Some people call it miracles. So, maybe the most important thing about synchronicities is our reaction to them. You know, through the course of a day or a week or a month, do you find yourself like thunderstruck or flabbergasted, amazed by life? Because synchronicities are like a glimpse of a wild animal that we don't see, or the discovery of something from the past, or the return of something that you haven't seen in years and you all of a sudden found it. Far removed from your mundane life, but synchronicities offer these little gifts of insight into our lives, and they bring about memories and they bring about thought. I remember just the other day, a couple weeks ago, my sister found my 8th grade junior high school yearbook and sent it to me, and I was like, wow. But she got it. My dad passed and she got that, and she found it, and she was looking through stuff and sent that to me. And all of a sudden, reading that thing and all the little comments and stuff like that, it just brought back so many memories of that time that I so deeply forgot. I just didn't really think much about it. But also, I ran across people that I hadn't seen since junior high school, but I really missed them. And so what happened was I got on Facebook and connected, and it was really interesting to connect with those people so many years later and see how different they are and see how different their life is. God only knows I've changed. But but if you look at this synchronicity, sometimes you should accept it as basically a wild card, or maybe an ordering principle, or a depth of profundity, or maybe a crack in the door, which will lead you to something greater in your life. A lot of people have an idea about synchronicity, and a lot of cases, they confuse it with the simple fact that sometimes all of us experience extraordinarily timely coincidences. But, synchronicity really removes the accident from the accidental nature of randomness and phenomena, and it can manifest itself as a coincidence, and that can be sometimes only the visible tip of something that is a greater synchronicity. To look at the distinction of our nature, there's some really interesting metaphors. We all have faith in the practical applications of electricity. So that light will turn on when you flip the switch, unless the light bulb's broken or something like that. But sometimes the light goes on and off at a very particular moment without you flipping the switch. Or, or a bolt of lightning strikes a tree on your property. Or, electrical coincidences may take place. But synchronicity is more to do with the very practical, deeply mysterious, lifelong relationship to the natural phenomenons. Like if a bolt of lightning strikes, a tree on the day somebody dies, that's a sign. I talked about my mom, interesting enough, they were on vacation a year before they passed, literally a year before they passed. And when they came home, and they lived out in the woods, a white owl came down their chimney apparently and was in their house eating their curtains because I couldn't eat anything and it couldn't get back out. And I guess it just fell down the chimney in the fireplace. And apparently, and my mom was half or about a quarter Cherokee. And so what's interesting about her was that I looked it up, and through some of the Indian literature, the white owl is a sign of death. And it's just, I just thought that was a deeply incredible coincidence that had happened a year before they actually died. But, we can correlate all kinds of crazy things that are indicators pointing to something else that happens in the future. Let's say if somebody is, you're hungry or something, and you're thinking of, you're craving something for lunch, and all of a sudden somebody comes up to you and says, hey, do you want to go to lunch? I'm hungry for this, that, and the other. There is a possibility to read beyond that coincidence that, we may be in sync with other people in our environment, but through Jung, the psychologist Carl Jung, he may have taken the example a little further by suggesting with synchronicity that love is revealed through synchronicity. and that we have an emotional bond that communicates differently with other people, that creates another dimension of communication where we are able to be there for each other in certain moments through the feelings that we have for each other. And that these are not just phenomenal signs, but they're deeply significant to the personal experience of our lives and to how we're created as people. And so he didn't define the principle as synchronicity as mystic, but he believed that there was a real witness to events in life that came clear about a mysterious underlying kind of field affecting how people relate to each other and certain people, how they can connect to each other. And so it's oftentimes, if you look at this as who is right for you when you're trying to look for a partner in life, somebody to marry, is it the one? Well, you don't know, but synchronicity is kind of the signal that our intuition uses to read that. And so it's interesting that synchronicity can play a very strong role in what we use to clock whether or not we're with somebody that we are connected to for life, and that this is the one. So, number one, we looked at meaningful coincidence. What is that? Well, it's random events that happen sometimes with specific personal meaning. We looked at the term causal connection, and that means despite there being no apparent material cause and effect, there's really a profound significance, and that there was an intentional connection there, and that's a causal connection. Then there's this term, and we didn't really talk about this, luminosity. And that's basically, and all of these have to do with coincidence, by the way, but that is basically the indication that all of this happens within a kind of shared field of divinity in communion with a greater God, with God. And across most life experiences, these three aspects actually do work to describe something that happens in everyone's life, even through though people don't really understand how. And then there's this scientific materialistic view. They see the conscious as individually brain-generated phenomenon, and it's generated independently by every conscious living thing. And it's basically a shared field that's assessed by every living thing through their sensory capabilities. And so, that in looking at it is a materialistic scientific view. And then there's this confirmation bias, and skeptics say it's all coincidence, chalking it up to about confirmation bias, which our very real tendency to remember our hits and forget our misses, and that synchronicity and that connectivity and coincidence has everything to do with a hit, and anything else is a miss. And then, some people believe that synchronicity is, though it's unpredictable, it's very reliable. And I have to say that we often do judge our life and judge the meaning of our life and to judge the meaning of events in our life based on coincidence. All right, that's our show. Thanks for listening. I'd love to hear from you.